People are being starved and then being shot when they seek a solution to that. And I met young people who were in tears just saying, why? I did exactly what I was told. I was in a caged area and then drones came over and drones fired. Why? If there is a famine, that's too late. Famine means mass deaths. Starvation, which is, a layer before, is happening. And starvation means that a child's body, its immune system is collapsing. There's already cognitive decline, which becomes irreversible in children. So children's bodies aren't waiting for some technical definition to occur.
Are member states complicit in what's going on?
There's certainly not the action required to stop this.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. What comes first, a peace deal or a peace prize? The war rages on in Gaza. Another 40 Palestinians were killed overnight in Israeli airstrikes. But Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been unable to thrash out a ceasefire deal despite 2 days of talks in Washington, though he did nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Meanwhile, in Gaza, families continue to struggle for food and water amid the constant bombardments and with an aid system that is failing to deliver. Joining me to discuss the situation is James Elder, global spokesperson for UNICEF, the United Nations agency providing humanitarian aid to children worldwide. He's just back from Gaza, his fifth visit to the territory since the war between Israel and Hamas began in October 2023. James Elder, just start by telling us what the situation is on the ground when you last saw it.
I was stunned to see how much worse it had got. I didn't think, I would see a population put under that much more stress. Somehow we've gone from that level of a population, a grave risk of starvation, children are starving, to water deprivation, forced water deprivation. This is purely political. This is not logistical. So to see this, Cathy, like a collision on a child's body now of a deprivation of food that everyone's heard about for a long time, but now a level of water which is way below any emergency standard. What that does to a child, but what that does to a community, the stress people see when suddenly they know the water truck is no longer coming. So to see that on top of, a child is being killed in Gaza every single hour since the horrors of October 7. So I go in hospitals and I see that every single day. So it was more of the same, which to any human is abhorrent and jarring, but somehow it's much, much worse. And that's largely around, as you say, a failed aid distribution and water deprivation.
I'll come back to what that looks like and the evidence you have for that. But, you've been there 5 times now. Have you seen each time you go back, it gets exponentially worse?
Yeah, and even this time, in a 2-week period that I was there, it got exponentially worse. And if I think of one, they say in Gaza, there's so many parts of you that feel guilty in Gaza, Cathy, and one of them is people will say that a day in Gaza is like dog years, like one day is like 7, and that's what it feels like. But, and I feel that over a 2-week period, but there's immense guilt even having that sense because there's an 8-year-old girl in Gaza who's been there for 640 days. There's guilt in Gaza when you eat a proper meal. There's guilt in Gaza at 1 o'clock in the morning where I put a pillow over my head because I just desperately need a little bit of sleep. So, but in that 2-week period, which feels like a long, long time, on about the second day, I met an elderly Palestinian man who was saying, look, James, we've learned to live without so much. We've learned to live without our homes that have been destroyed. We've learned to live without loved ones. Many of us have seen loved ones killed, but we can't live without food. I saw the same man 11 days later, and he said almost the same thing, which was we've learned to live without so much. Homes destroyed, loved ones killed, and we've even learnt we can live without food. Maybe even for a week, maybe 2, but we cannot live without water. So even the short period I was there, I was seeing that stress on communities. I met a little girl, Cathy, and we said, how are you? And she did the Arabic expression for fine, alhamdulillah. And my translator said, no, really, how are you? And she said, well, what do you want me to say? My mother was killed. I used to be beautiful, and now I spend every day chasing water trucks. So yeah, the situation of people is much, much worse and would horrify anyone.
And, famine has been haunting Gaza for months now. Would you say what you're seeing suggests it's happening?
No, but I don't think it matters to Palestinians. I think it's really useful that we have that world's best nutritional body that makes those warnings. And it's useful in a systematic sense because deprivations are systematic. That's not my opinion. We've seen that. And what we see is that a continual tightening and restrictions on the amount of humanitarian aid Israel lets in. And then you have these very clear evidence-driven warnings around the warning of famine. And then international pressure from member states mounts, and the restrictions are loosened and aid is allowed to flow, and then international tension wanes, and the noose is tightened again. We see that time and again. Now, the reality is that if there is a famine, that's too late. Famine means mass deaths. Starvation, which is, a layer before, is happening. And starvation means that a child's body, its immune system is collapsing. There's already cognitive decline, which becomes irreversible in children. So children's bodies aren't waiting for some technical definition to occur. And that's what I think is so harrowing there, to see this systematic deprivation. And now, of course, nutrition, we talk famine, but what do we talk about with water? There's no word that gets the world's attention, but there needs to be, because that's what's occurring right now for mums and dads and families in Gaza.
So, in your personal view, is Israel committing genocide?
I don't have the skill set to speak to that. I just don't. It's a legal definition. Francesca Albanese is very clear on the responsibility of member states to, if there are warning signs, to do all the things to prevent, any signs of that. So member states very, very clearly need to be patently aware of all the statements made and all the restrictions placed on a population. But, we know that a court will make that decision. For the people in Gaza right now, what's very clear for them is that children are being killed every single day. There is a level of indiscriminate fire. You don't have a reported 17,000 girls and boys killed, as we say. One child killed every hour. It's fearful that is somehow normalised. It's fearful that 85% of homes have been destroyed or damaged, and that also is somehow normalised. Those things should be triggering great action from member states.
Well, the Israeli government denies that conditions in Gaza are causing malnutrition. It says it's working with international organisations to get aid through and crossing the border from Israel into Gaza. What do you make of that?
I think it's the same statement we've made from the start, Cathy. Evidence is everything. So on one hand, this shouldn't be he said, she said. Firstly, we know we need international journalists on the ground. Secondly, I don't know from my own time, 2 decades as a humanitarian, at what point, UNICEF or the Voice of UN Workers isn't utterly impartial. And we know numerically that, around 50 trucks of aid are allowed in. That's 10% of what's needed. That's 1% if you allow for the blockade beforehand. So, and Israel won't deny that. So it's an absolutely inadequate amount of aid for a population already on their knees. And then, there are attempts to sideline a humanitarian system that has worked very well, and we need to look to that. We can look to the humanitarian system that's worked from Somalia to Afghanistan to Sudan right now, or we could look to a humanitarian system 2 months ago in a ceasefire. Humanitarian aid, you have to be driven by two things. One is reaching those most in need, and the other is an evidence base that your interventions are improving the situation. So during the ceasefire, we saw that. We saw 400 distribution points, an organisation like UNICEF going door to door on malnutrition. We saw malnutrition start to decrease. We saw disease start to decrease. We saw access to water increase. The sidelining of that humanitarian system and being replaced by half a dozen for distribution points that are militarised in the south has none of that evidence base whatsoever. It has the exact opposite, of course. So we have to look to evidence that the situation of people on the ground is improving, and it's gotten much, much worse again in the last month or two.
Well, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, began as an effort to bypass Hamas control of aid. Given the amount of theft that went on, at the hands of Hamas, that sounds like a noble idea, doesn't it?
Well, no, there's 3 parts to this, if I can. One is aid diversion. So there's aid diversion and there's aid looting. Aid diversion is basically that all the aid is being taken by Hamas. The International Crisis Group, a leading think tank, has said it's less than 1%. So it's less than Somalia, less than northern Nigeria. It's not a relevant amount. So that's just objectively false, demonstrably false. And as UNICEF has said, we've asked for evidence time and again on this aid diversion. So that's false. Looting, of course, is the economics of scarcity. Looting does occur when, we're in London right now, if you have half of London deprived of all food, water, medicine for 2 to 3 months, and then you allow a truck to go down Victoria Street, people will take what they can from that truck. During the ceasefire, there was no aid looting because there was no black market. So that's looting, that's diversion. So there's no evidence, and then there's no logic, of course, because we have to remember that food aid is not just food. Aid is incubators, aid is oxygen, aid is medicine, aid is hygiene packs for women and girls. So there's no logic, there's no evidence. Then let's move away from food for a moment and let's just look at water. Water goes from the source to the recipient. Why on earth are there such restrictions that we now have a risk of children dying of thirst? We have a meningitis. If not an outbreak, we have great spikes in meningitis. That's based on deprivations of water, deprivations of food, deprivations of medical care, and populations being forced into an area. So this is not around allegations of who's got the evidence and who hasn't. Well, this is exactly around who's got the evidence and who hasn't.
Well, I mean, you asked that question rhetorically, why are people not getting enough water? What's your answer to that question?
The answer can only be that, this is there is an intent to deny a population, the means it needs right now for survival. And it's not needed for, UN officials to make these statements. These statements are made. But Israel challenges that. They say it's disinformation. Is this where the problem of not having international journalists on the ground comes in? Because you can't verify claim and counterclaim. No, because, for example, a lot of water in Gaza comes through desalination plants, and they require electricity. And Israel turned off the electricity after the horrors of October 7 and made it very clear that they were doing that. Now, UNICEF actually lobbied to get that turned on again, and that runs your desal plants. But that's been turned off since the ceasefire broke. Now, no one will claim that that's not the case. So when you've got pipelines that Israel controls and electricity, which desal plants is the production, the treatment, and the distribution of water. No one's making those. It's just the fog of war. But unfortunately for the civilians in Gaza, the mums, the dads, the families, it's very, very clear the level of deprivation and done with, unfortunately, statements of intent not made by me, but made by people, in positions of power to change that.
Well, we've seen hundreds of Palestinians killed as they queue for aid being delivered by this private American-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. And the Israel Defense Forces have rejected allegations of deliberately firing on civilians. Do you have any explanation as to why starving people are being shot?
No, I found it so harrowing, Cathy. I met young people who were in tears, whose family had begged them not to go, but they're being starved. Okay, people are starved, and they suddenly being starved, and then, as you say, being shot when they seek a solution to that. And I met young people who were in tears, just saying, "Why? I hid for 5 hours. I did exactly what I was told. I was in a caged area, and then drones came over and drones fired. Why? Why would they do that?" I met a little boy who, this little guy, he's 13-year-old boy, Abed al-Rahman. He was given money by his parents, their only money, to go and buy bread. Again, this is a family that on technical definitions, the entire family's malnourished. This little boy sees that's his situation of his mum being given money. Cathy, he goes out onto the street and he saw large numbers of people moving to one of these sites. They are militarized sites, remembering. This is one of the reasons the United Nations cannot support them, because next thing we are supporting people to go and to be shot en route to try and recover aid. This little boy went there. I met him in hospital. He will always stick with me. He went, there was firing, he ran, he left without a box, he left without any food aid at all. There was a tank shell fired. When I met this little guy, he had shrapnel in his stomach, he had shrapnel in his pancreas. His mum wanted a video for social media because they had a medical evacuation form, Cathy. So he sat up. I remember this little guy with all his energy. He sat up, he held onto my arm in immense pain. This was 2:00 in the afternoon. He'd had 5 meals of painkillers earlier that morning because there's a grave lack of painkillers for children. Every now he'd wince with this horrible pain, but this brave kid just wanted to sit up. He told his story and his father. It's quite a, patriarchal society. His father was in tears because this little boy was saying, "I just wanted to get food for my family." That was the scenario of just a boy simply trying to feed his family, feed his mum and his sisters. And on the final day that I left Gaza, again in this 2-week period, he died of his injuries.
How do you respond to something like that? A terrible, tragic story.
Oh, Cathy, for me, I was in a bus leaving Gaza. So honestly, you have a moment, I picture his mum constantly holding this medical evacuation form that was meant to get him out of Gaza, a system that's just not working based on the reluctance of member states to accept people. I pictured his entire family. I had this moment, Cathy, of thinking for 30 seconds, okay, right, so we've done everything we can again, told people stories, seen what UNICEF's program is like, and had almost 30 seconds of feeling like, all right, well, we left nothing there, and then saw that message, and that somehow Gaza, that people just, you don't have a moment of respite until another piece of brutal news. So and the picture I have right now is again of his utterly distraught mother whilst he was alive.
So when you hear Benjamin Netanyahu describing claims that troops have fired deliberately on civilians as malicious falsehoods designed to defame the Israeli military, and, again, talk of a disinformation campaign propagated by Hamas. How do you respond to that from what you yourself have witnessed?
Yeah, it's very hard because I've had horrible things said to me as well. And I know very clearly in my heart why I've done this work and why, whether I want to raise the voice of a mum in Sudan or a little girl in Haiti, a child is a child. And at what point did it suddenly become controversial to speak about 17,000 girls and boys reportedly killed, or controversial for us to advocate that incubators should be allowed into Gaza because children right now are dying unnecessarily because medical staff are hand pumping oxygen with 3 children in an incubator? Or at what point am I having to advocate that water's allowed in? So something's gone horribly wrong here.
But it's awful to argue about figures and for figures to become contested, but they have become contested, haven't they? And, you're sort of in the midst of that, aren't you?
Yeah, yes, very much so. But I feel now, because UNICEF, we verify things so intensely. So for UNICEF to speak publicly on things, we don't, when we said, for example, war on children, we don't seek a headline. We seek to absolutely use data and evidence always. So the great concern now is when we say 17,000 children reportedly killed. We say that because in past conflicts, when thousands of children have been killed in Gaza, when we've done what's called our triangular verification, which takes 6 months, it's been within a couple of percentage points of the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. So unfortunately, the fear now from people is that is an undercount. Now, we don't know, but either way, as I've often thought, Cathy, let's hope it's wrong. Let's hope it's only 5,000 children have been killed. 5,000 children killed. It's still 5,000 and it's still more yesterday and it's more today. Unfortunately, it does sound much more like it's more than 15,000 than 5,000. And
whether it is 5,000 or 15,000, those are individual children who have lost their lives.
Yeah, and more are. Again, I sat with every hospital bed room you're in has got 3 or 4 children with the wounds of war, and they're all utterly grotesque. And I can just picture one particular room, Cathy, and there's a little girl in their cellar and she was 11. The bomb blast had hit her. She had her left leg amputated. But because, again, despite the doctors' best efforts, they're working 24-hour shifts, they're living in tents, despite their best efforts because of a lack of drugs, they had to amputate this little girl. So she's just being dissembled. So she's sitting there. And then Yana is here. Yana was brushing her teeth when a missile struck in her school shelter, brushing her teeth. This little girl was paralysed from the waist down. She's 11, Cathy, and she lay there paralysed. She was explaining this, lay there paralysed. But because she's paralysed, obviously she couldn't move. She was conscious. She watched her friend die in front of her. This is a single hospital bed with the other boy in that room who was shot in the head by a quadcopter as he was evacuating because he was told to evacuate at 2:00 in the morning. That's one hospital bed. There's scores of them, and that's just one day. I'm bearing witness to a single day. That's what should be so harrowing or should be so alarming.
And because of the absence of international media, you see it as a sort of core part of your job to bear witness, as you put it.
Yeah, I think, my job should be always to go and bear witness and to explain what UNICEF is doing. And the nice thing with UNICEF's mandate is we do cash grants, we do education, we do trauma, we do things that aren't supply driven. And then we push hard to get in, the supplies for water and nutrition. That's the breadth of UNICEF's work. But I am talking about that less than 5% of the time because it's the grave violations occurring to children should have forced member states to act so much more stridently, so much earlier on this. So it seems to me so much clearer, whilst international press can't be allowed, are not allowed in, are banned from bearing witness to the atrocities, banned to adding to the very brave Palestinian voices, then it seems only right for me to take those stories of those people as well who they're very generous and they're very gracious. You sit with a mum whose daughter has been paralysed and she's, yes, talk to my daughter. Let me tell you her story. I'm not sure I'd be that gracious if a aid worker was doing that whilst I had a medical evacuation form that was not doing what it was supposed to do.
Are member states complicit in what's going on?
There's certainly not the action required to stop this, and I think it's very, very clear as well. We are only talking about the most basic. We're talking about letting humanitarian aid flow. We're talking about letting water flow. Yes, there is a complication, it would seem, to a ceasefire. Okay, whilst the politics plays out in a ceasefire, because maybe that's only in the hands of a few, surely there is much more leverage when it comes to medical evacuation of children, ensuring that children don't die of thirst, and ensuring proper humanitarian aid flows as it does in Sudan, as it does in the DRC, as it does, in Ethiopia. On those fronts, much more needs to be done. But you and I had this conversation 18 months ago.
Let's talk about the peace plan then, because Donald Trump has said that the talks on a peace deal in Gaza have been going along very well. Do you share his optimism? Do you think there is the basis potentially for a permanent peace, or just a temporary ceasefire might help?
I have to, Cathy, go with everyday people on the ground who are so desperate, who literally would say to me, we hope, but hope is not a strategy, who saw their hope blown up a dozen times in 2024. Let's not forget, through the course of 2024, every single promise and the cusp of ceasefire turned to nothing. That meant parents again, had to lie next to their children at night time in a tent, not knowing if they would survive the night or not. So the Palestinians on the ground are absolutely no longer foolish in terms of what is real and what isn't. But as a humanitarian, we know that for aid to flow like it did, when we had 400 distribution points, when UNICEF went door to door, that happened during a ceasefire. Hostages go home in ceasefire. More than 150 hostages during ceasefire negotiations. That's when that abhorrence ends. Less than 10, a handful under military means. So, irrespective of my own hopes, it is the only sane thing for children, families, hostages, everyone. As my executive director said again 20 months ago, Cathy, that peace in the Middle East is not going to be gained by the destruction of Gaza and the killing of so many children. That statement, tragically, still holds very, very true.
Netanyahu has nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. Donald Trump himself points out very loudly that he's kept the peace between Congo and Rwanda, India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, for now at least. Now potentially Israel and Hamas. Does he deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, perhaps?
I don't know the parameters, but I certainly know every single Palestinian, if there is a lasting peace, and I would like to think every single person in the region will celebrate that moment accordingly.
In the meantime, let's look at what might happen in Gaza next. There's been this proposal from Israel's defense minister for a humanitarian camp built on the ruins of Rafah. Having been there, spent time there repeatedly, what do you make of that plan?
Wow, again, you and I actually spoke a long time ago at the end of 2023 about the danger of these self-imposed safe zones. And what we spoke about was to make sure that you can't have a safe zone that doesn't have food and water and the basics to survival. And that was us making that very clear, because none of those things were present. The assumption was that if they were created unilaterally, they wouldn't be bombed. Then we saw so-called safe zones created without food, without sanitation, without all the basics for survival, and then bombed. So now, if I understand it, and I haven't followed it closely enough, now the sense is to create a cage within a cage. So at a time when looks to be a worrying increase in meningitis cases, you would trap people in an area without the medical care. And Rafah had European hospital, that's not functional. Without the medical care, imposing more restrictions on people's movement, less restrictions on access to medical care. I can't see how I'm only looking pragmatically. On a principled approach, anyone will tell you that that's a breach of many, many international humanitarian law, but it seems that international humanitarian law has been discarded. I think that's very worrisome as well. I think that has been, for an entire generation of people, a bedrock in countries, and we should be very wary before we do so willfully discard international humanitarian law or will allow it to be discarded.
You just said a cage within a cage. I mean, is that what humanity has come to?
I don't know. I'm fearful of that. I'm almost surprised taken by the proposal. So again, I would hope that we do not get into this normalisation that hospitals being bombed and reported of 17,000 children, and the idea that water and incubators are denied, that those things are normal. Certainly the idea of forcibly pushing more than 500,000 people into an area that's been devastated, I would hope that that's ruled out very, very quickly, but I fear it's not.
And when you hear Donald Trump talking about his plans to permanently resettle Palestinians living in Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu has said it's a brilliant vision. It's called free choice. If people want to stay, they can stay, but if they want to leave, they should be able to leave. Described in those terms, what do you make of it?
Well, I think right now, I don't think we've had any conflict that I recall in living memory whereby an entire population, you have your home bombed and you're forced in a tent and you're not safe there and you've lost loved ones and there's no access to medical care and you can't leave. So the first problem is why for 21 months has Israel denied people the ability to leave a war zone? Now, if there is peace, and then people are allowed to leave, then of course, but people absolutely must have a right to return. There is something very special. I'm not going to speak for Palestinians who may want to leave or may want to stay, but certainly there's a few things I've learnt with Palestinians. One is the literacy rate, which means their ability to recover is immense. 98% literacy rates. They are the envy of the region. The other is, Cathy, when I was in Gaza City recently, I was surprised just how much of that city still stands. Colleagues and Palestinians I'd met talked to me about day one of the ceasefire. They were having cappuccino and cake. I thought they were teasing me. That was real. That's not a cliche about Palestinians' ability to bounce back. It's because so many horrendous things have happened to them over decades. They have systems in place and an education rate in place to bounce back. So by all means, let's have a ceasefire and let's give people a chance to breathe. But let's, of course, ensure that people get to still call their home home. I
mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Amidst so much despair, I suppose you can cling on to small fragments of hope in that way and hope perhaps that Gaza can be rebuilt?
I really did. And there's certain things, Cathy, people said. I remember a young colleague, 25 years old. Her home has been destroyed. She walks with me through hospital, so she hears all those stories which are never ending. Her own marriage she broke off because she doesn't believe it's right to do that in a time of war. She's 25 years old. We talked about the ceasefire and she was explaining how life came back and she said, James, we love life. Now that struck me because I'm Australian, we love life. From the UK, people here love life. People wouldn't say that. Palestinians say that, and I think it's because they feel the fragility, but they feel the preciousness of it. So my goodness, when they are given a chance based on their knowledge of, engineering and computer science and medicine and simply a love of community, there is an immense reason to be hopeful.
I mean, just standing back, your 5 visits and what you've absorbed from all of that. You are a very senior figure in the world's biggest humanitarian organisation. Do you feel helpless amidst what you see in Gaza?
On a personal level, and speaking for a lot of people in the United Nations and a lot of brave colleagues who are on the front lines right now, there is definitely a sense of anger and frustration. Of course, the benefit is when you are in Gaza, you see the impact. I get to see, I'm well aware of the restrictions and denials of aid. I also get to see UNICEF giving magic, nutritional food to a grandmother. So there is an anger and a frustration, but you have to channel that. There is absolutely not despair. Ours is not despair to hold, I don't think. You cannot possibly pass on despair to a new generation. And I'm fortunate, Cathy, I do meet so many Palestinians who are far brighter, far sharper, and who absolutely they themselves are not giving up. So in that sense, I don't feel it's my right. There are certainly images and stories and things I've seen and things I've smelt that I wish I never had. But overall, ours is not one to give up for Palestinians, because as much as we're exhausted, as much as we want to turn away, Palestinians on the ground living in tents right now cannot turn away from this horror show.
Gaza is just one of your areas of focus. There's so many conflict zones across the globe. Does it take too much of your time? Do you have to sort of pull back and go elsewhere, however painful that might be?
No, because UNICEF is lucky. We are in all these countries, So I have amazing colleagues in Sudan, in Port-au-Prince, in the DRC, in Afghanistan, and so in that sense, no. I'm very conscious myself. If we look at Sudan, Sudan is 5 million children displaced, and as you and I said earlier, I believe that in my heart. As a child is a child in Israel, a child in Sudan. I think that the weight that we have at the moment on this is very important because we see international humanitarian law under absolute attack. There are dangerous precedents being set in Gaza that are at risk of having a spill-on effect for children in other countries, and that's why there is also potentially a disproportionate focus right now on what's being done to children, to mums, to women in Gaza.
Yeah, we're not talking about Sudan the way we're talking about Gaza. Is that wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. When you talk to a woman and who will have escaped what she's been through in Darfur and has walked for 11 days and has held onto her child and has just the same level of passion and hope, and particularly in Darfur because 20 years ago, a lot of those 27-year-old women went through that and how they thought they were getting a break from that and what they will do to get their children educated. There are great parallels. Every mum would do that for their child, so there is no doubt that the world has turned away from that. We have famine in Sudan, so absolutely.
But people watching are horrified by what they see unfolding in Gaza. When it appears on our screens, they share the same horror about Sudan. But is there a sense of compassion fatigue? How do you combat that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is, and I have a great deal of empathy for the average person, the viewer, and so on, because I constantly try to challenge my own perspective on things, and so I'm trying to reach out to a broad array of people, and I feel that people who care are exhausted by what they see, and they're frustrated by not feeling like they can do enough. Now, I don't think that member states, people in positions of power, get to have compassion fatigue because we are seeing right now, for example, huge cuts to the aid sector across the developed world. Now, there are great reasons in practice, in principle, why that is a terrible idea. There's also fiscal reasons. It's very important that audiences understand the savings made are so minuscule, yet the impact that would have to a doctor in Gaza or a mum who ends up in Chad are absolutely immense, and they are great levels of soft power as well for governments like the UK. I'm lucky too. I get to travel these places and I get to hear how people in Haiti and the DRC speak about, for example, the English government and the way that they see that. So people are baffled as to why they've had the carpet pulled out from beneath them.
Well, just finally then, make your pitch now. What do you need from member states? What do you need from the UK government?
Aid has to be back to a level that it was previously. Years ago, you have to...
The 0.7%?
0.7%
of gross national income.
And it's less than that. And there are large portions of a population who don't understand that. And it goes beyond principle. We should be able to argue in principle, Cathy, but investing in a girl in the UK or in Bangladesh or in Kenya is the most cost-effective thing you can possibly do. And we're in a globalised world now, so you can also make that case based on migration and security. You save money now versus what things look like in 10 or 15 years. So yet again, the practical arguments and the principled arguments to invest for those governments who have space to do that is overwhelming.
James Elder, thank you very much. That's it for this episode of The Fourcast. Until next time, goodbye.